An Ecology of Mind, directed by Nora Bateson, has just had its premiere in New York and now is hitting Europe. What's this film about, Nora?
This film, An Ecology of Mind, is about looking at the way that we see the world. It's about my father, Gregory Bateson's work. And his work was very interdisciplinary in nature. People always ask me, what did he do? And for some people, he was an anthropologist. For other people, he was a psychologist. For some people, he was very instrumental in the beginning of the information sciences or in ecology. And really what his work was about was looking at the world through a lens in which all those things were integrated. So what this film is about his lens and the relevance right now of learning to look at the world in that way. And you know, the old story of Humpty Dumpty. This is about putting Humpty Dumpty back together again and reuniting all these pieces of the world that have become so specialized and separated. And within these false separations, there's a kind of violence that's taking place. And we identify that violence in terms of psychological pathologies, ecological pathologies, economic pathologies, social pathologies. And we think there's all these things going wrong. What are all the problems? But there might just be one problem, and it might be at the level of how we see the world.
Gregory Bateson was very much utilized by psychology and psychotherapy. Being a person informed on the facts from inside through your contact with your dad, what you reckon was his relationship with psychology, psychotherapy in general, and with the use psychologists were doing of his own material?
It's a very tricky question. First of all, I think it's important to note that I don't think that he saw really any discipline as being terribly separate from any other discipline. So that's the first thing I want to be absolutely clear about. His work in anthropology or in ecology or biology or even in information science was really about the exact same thing that his work in psychology was. So for him, it was a different cast of characters, but he was looking at patterns, big patterns. And for Gregory, the world is made of relationships. And that's an easy thing to say and a very difficult thing to actually take in. So he would say, and this is in the film, if you look at your hand, that you've been trained to see 5 fingers. But really what's important there are the 4 spaces. And if we could look at the world in terms of those relationships, those 4 spaces are what give your hand its articulation, the potentialities, all the possibilities, its functionality. So in terms of the role of psychology, he was looking at the world in terms of relationships. What are relationships made of? Communication. So he was interested in mental process and in psychology on the level that he was interested in biological structure and the same kind of patterns of communication that he saw happening there. In fact, there's a quote of his that says, if you want to study biological structure, look at mental process. And if you want to study mental process, look at biological structure. So these lenses were, they were one. I mean, it's almost a misuse of the word interdisciplinary, because that implies that there's these different things happening at the same, and really what he was he had a lens that was in unity. So psychology, anthropology, there really wasn't that much difference, just a change in category and a change in rhetorical language.
He was involved with the Palo Alto Mental Research Institute for some years. Mm-hmm. Then he went off to Hawaii, where we recollect precisely the history. What were his confessions regarding, his private confessions in the family regarding his previous involvement in the Mental Research Institute, and then his switch to the Hawaii with John Lilly, and then the final years of his life? How did the whole relationship develop to psychology? I don't know if you can, there are things you can't reveal.
I can reveal patterns for sure.
Yeah.
And I think that one of the repeating patterns in his life was that he would get involved in different disciplines, and then eventually they would close in on him. And by that I mean that he was frustrated by the lack of the ability of the psychological profession, discipline, to really embrace other points of view. And his viewpoint was one in which there were many different perspectives going on. And it was frustrating. To this day, actually, I think it's worse now than it was then. So, when he got tired of dealing with the way humans communicated, he went to go look at the way dolphins communicate. But I think it's important to note that his frustrations with psychotherapy were not so different than his frustrations with his original studies in zoology at Cambridge, or in the world of anthropology. That each one of these disciplines came to a point where they put him in a corner, and at that point he switched and went to do something else.
Nora, how did the idea of this film come about?
Well, it's kind of an impossible thing to think about making a film about Gregory Bateson. I mean, his work is all in the realm of ideas. So the concept of making a film, it took a while to generate, and at the same time I've always worked in media and in storytelling, and my degrees are in that, and it just made sense that one day I was going to do that. When his centennial year came around, there was a need for some audiovisual. My sister asked me to put something together, and I very innocently said yes, and then once I got into the material, I realized the kind of complexity that this project was going to be more than I bargained for. So it took me a long time to gather all the pieces. There's a lot of old footage in there from all sorts of different media, different eras, everything from 16 millimeter Bolex shot in Bali in the 30s to brand new HD shot on discs. I mean, there's everything in there. So gathering the pieces and then figuring out what to do with them meant breaking a lot of rules for how we talk about not only issues of representation of another person in media, but also what's a movie about? And this movie is about ideas and about someone who had these ideas.
Was there a logic sequence, storyboard you had ready firsthand, or did the connection of ideas come about after the film was shot?
Something like both. We had an idea of what the ladder was going to be. I like to think of it in terms of a ladder because at first I wanted to make this film about Gregory's idea of beauty. But as I started to look at what that really entailed, I realized that in order to do that, I had to build a whole conceptual nest for that idea. And that dictated a kind of linearity through some very nonlinear ideas. Honestly, this film could have been organized in infinite different ways. So I worked on the layout for it, but then also there were a lot of changes in the moment. Thinking, oh, this will work, and then realizing, actually this doesn't work, let's fix it. So,
for somebody who hasn't seen the film, how could you synthesize the story and the teaching of this film?
Okay, how could I synthesize the teaching of this film? The film itself is inspired from a couple different directions. One is to look at Gregory and not his accomplishments, but the way that he thought that led him to his accomplishments. I kind of figured that other people will make movies about his accomplishments, and we'll call those the golden eggs. But nobody's going to make a film about the goose. So, being that I'm his daughter, I have a kind of a special access to that. Secondly, though, Gregory used to always say the point of the probe is always in the heart of the explorer. And so I told this story, this film is done in the first person. It's from my perspective, and it's very much ethically, narratively, and subjectively my version of Gregory. For me, that felt like the best and most efficient, most ethical approach to talking about him. And so there's all of Gregory's ideas and what was important to Gregory, but then what this film is about what was important to me about what was important to Gregory. So that's an important distinction because there's no question that I have a lot of personal concern around what kind of understanding we're generating about the world that we live in and all the different kinds of crises that we face right now: economic, ecological, psychological, sociological, and so on. So I very much entered this project with that as the kind of relevance sounding board of how do these ideas fit in now and what can we utilize. The big thing that we can utilize just right off the bat is the question of how does the way that we think affect what we do. There's a lot of pressure put on anyone who's in a position of responsibility in this moment to take action. And yet the paradox is that, as Einstein said, no problem can be solved from the same level of consciousness that created it. So this pressure for action is in some way worth looking at, because it may be that without a shift at the level of our thinking, we're actually not capable of creating new paradigms of living.
this obviously takes us to the application of Gregory's approach to the behavioral sciences, and his relationship with psychology and psychotherapy was critical, was awkward. And your own approach to psychotherapy, your position towards psychotherapy, is rather wary. Do you agree with this feeling I have?
I think that I would say that my position toward psychotherapy and, honestly, I'm not sure really what use it is anymore to regard psychotherapy as something different from ecology or anthropology or aesthetics. And where my work lies is in the integration, the stitching back together, a kind of perception that can see the world as a whole. So our problems are as much ecological as they are psychological, as they are cultural, as they are built into our linguistics of our language itself. If you want to get at the question of where the pathologies are, where are we going wrong? It's in a systemic pattern. So until we can begin to even acknowledge that these patterns are there and that that's where the pathologies lie, we perpetually chase after one thread or another on a linear campaign to put out this fire and put out that fire, and meanwhile the source itself is smoldering. So for me, I definitely see that there's a lot of good work to be done in the realm of psychotherapy and also in many other disciplines. But that without the communication and the acknowledgement of the deep integration of all of these pieces, honestly, they're all rendered blind.
The word epistemology, after Gregory Bateson, changes slightly orientation. From the idea of philosophy of science, it becomes the framework, the frame of reference you use in whatever you do. Could you define the way you use the word epistemology?
Okay.
Or could you express your epistemology?
My epistemology of epistemology, how about that? For me, I use the word epistemology to refer to a kind of a frame or a lens that each of us has through which we make sense of the world, through which we experience the world. So your experience of something and my experience of something are completely different, from the connotations we have around certain words to our experience of a physical encounter, to the way that we might experience the taste of an apple. There's no way that we can really ever have access to an objective or the raw, the real. So what we have is a kind of, it's useful, I think, to think of it as a kind of a picture frame. And it frames the art that is you, the aesthetic that is you or me. So I see epistemology as really very integral to the idea of having systems communication and creating interdependence. So your epistemology and my epistemology and somebody else's, we are all very different. And because of that, we have things that we can share. We are very independent at that level. But at all the other levels, we're interdependent. And our ability to share whichever piece of the truth we can see through our frame is an incredible and dynamic process.
Gregory Bateson was a major influence in Western American counterculture, Californian counterculture, and it still is a very major influence. Could you comment on that?
Gregory Bateson is a major influence. Yeah, but he's sneaky. He's kind of an invisible influence. There are many disciplines and schools of thought that have been deeply, deeply influenced by his work. However, because for two reasons. One is because his work was so interdisciplinary that nobody actually was able to capture the whole thing and say, he's an anthropologist, he's a psychologist, he's a biologist. They can pull out pieces, and those pieces became very important. However, he's hard to read. And he used to be much harder to read. The culture has developed quite a bit. Our use of language and our ability to work with ideas of systemic dynamics are growing. So it's not as hard as it used to be. But when An Ecology of Mind and Mind and Nature came out, we could barely really figure out what to do with the word connected. I mean, that was a tough one, to think about the world as being interconnected. Now we're pretty used to that. And still Gregory pushes us one step further and says, yeah, but what about interrelated, interdependent? Is one step further.
I gather that Gregory was rather reluctant to enter the psychotherapy movement, but nevertheless he joined the Mental Research Institute in Palo Alto, and from which he eventually withdrew to go and work with John Lilly with the dolphins in Hawaii. How did he refer to this shift of activity of his?
If you look at Gregory's life, you can see it as a set of almost as false starts. You could look at it and say, he started anthropology, he quit. He started information science, he quit. He started psychology, he quit. He started communications and behavioral studies, learning, he quit. And so on. Ecology, and then he quit. In fact, what was happening there is that he was applying a certain, like we were saying, a lens, and his lens was about looking at the patterns of interrelationship. So when he went into anthropology, that's what he was looking for. When he went into the Macy conferences and the beginning of information science, cybernetics, that's what he was looking for, was these patterns. So when you look at the world in terms of interrelationships, the first question is, what are relationships made of? Relationships are made of communication. Now, in human communication, we refer to the study of that as psychology. Sometimes we look at it through the lens of linguistics. Maybe it's anthropology. Maybe it could be all sorts of things, family therapy. So Gregory's work was always about looking for different ways of seeing patterns of communication. Now, every discipline that he got involved in started to push him toward a corner and to begin to identify him as an anthropologist or a biologist or a psychologist or a this or a that. You know, they sign up and become this thing, become a specialist in this department. And he was reluctant to do that, always, because then he couldn't look from other directions. It was contrary to the very source of his curiosity.
After having ended the film, after having shown the film, how do you feel? And do you feel ready for something new? Are you done with this chapter? Is this chapter going to be expanded? What's the next chapter?
I don't know. I don't know what the next chapter is. There is another film that I'd like to make, but right now I don't have time because this film is traveling around the world, particularly around Europe, South America, and there's kind of an unexpected result that has emerged, which is that the film itself is very dense. It has a lot of ideas in it. And what I didn't really expect is that there's a kind of a thirst in the world for these ideas. We're all kind of tired of media that doesn't have anything to chew on in it, you know? And at the end of an hour, the film's only an hour long, it's really delightful to engage with the audience and maybe with a panel in a kind of a systems dialogue that can deal with looking at some of the questions we have about where we're going right now, globally and personally, in a way that addresses the dynamics of interrelationship in a completely different way. Because at the end of the movie, we've all been soaked in that world, and there's kind of a new toolbox to use. So I didn't see that coming, but I really am enjoying it. And of course, it's an enormous honor to hear people laughing at, Gregory's jokes, and to see people enjoying his ideas is great.
One more question, please. How did the close relatives respond to your creation on Gregory Cascone, on Gregory Bateson? And the living relatives are your mother and your sister.
And my two brothers.
And your two brothers, yeah. How did they respond to what you created?
I think that the family's been nothing but completely supportive.
Would they identify with your angle of vision? Or would they contribute?
Yeah, okay. Everybody would have told their own story.
Yeah.
Right? So that's the nature of the beast. There's no way around that. And fair enough. This is, like I said, this is my Gregory. It's not my sister's, and it's not my brother's, and it's not my mother's. And I took liberties with the format of biography. I think it would be a mistake to think of this film as a biography. Mm-hmm. I think of it as a portrait. And let's see, how to say this? I didn't want to get involved in the dirty laundry of biography. I didn't actually see any reason to do that. I figure if I have an hour and my task is to see if I can make Gregory Bateson understandable in an hour, that's a big enough task. I don't also need to, lay out all his foibles and mistakes in the world for some kind of, controversy and whatever, edge. It's just, in this movie, there's nothing cynical.
How did you organize the premiere with the relatives? The relatives just came to the public premiere, or did you make private screening? What happened? Was it a very emotional occasion when they first saw your film? The relatives?
Everybody in the family was involved all along. So they saw versions, and it took me a long time to make the film, so they were pretty familiar with what the material was going to be. When I first started finding the footage, and like I said, there's all this old footage from all these different directions. That is emotional. It's a strange thing to see someone that you know and love that has died alive again and talking on camera. They're just the little nuances of their breath or those little things that a still picture doesn't convey that, the resonance of their voice or so that's moving. But anybody would have that. If you saw footage of a relative or a loved one, you would have the same experience. So it's nothing particular. But I did learn quite a bit from it. The process itself was enormously educational. Not only in terms of becoming familiar with Gregory's ideas, but also in terms of my own personal journey through life. And I was 12 when Gregory died. And because I was young, he explained all his ideas and things to me when I was, obviously, before I had a big education to hold those ideas in. And then, as I grew older and developed that education, I learned that people within academics and so on find that those ideas are very difficult, and they could never imagine that it would be possible to understand or to convey those ideas without a huge academic framework. So in a way, I was ironically prepared perfectly for this kind of fold in his legacy to take place. And I didn't really see that. I don't know that he saw it, but it certainly is interesting to think about what's happening in the communication between generations. What are you leaving behind? And what are your children receiving? And how might they then create something to leave behind? I think that's worth looking at.
Thanks very much, Nora.